January 1944. London rain slicks the cobblestones outside Allied force quarters, and inside, the air smells of stale tobacco and damp wool. Maps of the French coast cover the heavy oak tables. Officers lean over the blue-lined paper. They plan the largest invasion in human history. One man stands at the head of the table. He is not looking at the maps. He looks at a requisition order for 1,500 shallow-draft landing craft. He picks up a fountain pen. He does not sign. He draws a thick line through the request. He calls the boats Plywood Coffins. He says the Navy will not send men to die in boxes made of scrap wood. He demands steel, or he demands a delay. He is willing to stall the war. He does not know that a general with ivory revolvers is coming to sink his pride in a basin of water. This is the story of a naval blockade born not from enemy minds, but from the stubborn pride of an American admiral. It was a confrontation that decided if the liberation of Europe would happen in 1944 or never at all. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth behind the myths of military glory. Andrew Higgins was 57 years old. He hailed from the humid shipyards of New Orleans, Louisiana. He did not carry a degree in naval engineering. He did not possess a family name that opened doors in Washington. He was a man of the mud. He had built his reputation on shallow-draft boats designed for trappers and smugglers who needed to disappear into the bayous. He understood the physics of the swamp better than any man alive. He had spent his life savings and his own physical health to create a craft that could run onto a beach and back off again without stalling. He had seen his ideas mocked by the high command for years. He lived in a constant state of motion, fueled by a singular obsession to give the infantry a way to reach the shore. He stood in the London rain knowing that without his boats, the invasion was a suicide mission. Rear Admiral Clayton Forsyth was 54 years old. He was a creature of the Annapolis class of 1912. He had spent his entire career in the halls of procurement and the quiet offices of the Navy Department. He had never commanded a ship in a theater of war. He had never felt the spray of a cold Atlantic swell on his face. He believed in the absolute superiority of steel. In his mind, the Navy was a collection of heavy cruisers and massive battleships. He viewed anything made of wood as a relic of a primitive age. He arrived at the joint planning meeting, wearing a dress uniform so crisp, it looked carved from stone. His gold cufflinks gleamed under the electric lights of the war room. He looked at the mud-spattered boots of the infantry colonels around him with open disdain. He had decided that the lives of American boys could not be trusted to a boat built by a civilian from New Orleans. He was ready to stop the war to save the Navy's prestige. The world was a map of arrows and supply lines. In the east, the Red Army was grinding through the winter snow. In the south, the Italian campaign had turned into a muddy stalemate. Everyone knew the real blow had to come from the west. The coast of France waited under a shroud of bunkers and barbed wire. The German 7th Army was digging in. They were pouring millions of tons of cement into the Atlantic Wall. The English Channel was the only barrier. It was a cold, treacherous stretch of water. It had stopped every invader since the days of Napoleon. To cross it, the Allied planners needed a miracle of logistics. They needed a way to put thousands of tanks and 100,000 men onto a beach without a harbor. London was a city of secrets and uniforms. Every hotel was a headquarters. Every basement was a radio room. The tension was a physical weight in the air. The Americans and the British argued over dates and weather patterns. Behind the scenes, a different war was being fought. It was a war of procurement. It was a war of signatures and contracts. The Navy had always been the senior service. They controlled the waves. They believed the landing was their operation. They did not trust civilian builders. They did not like new ideas. Other officers saw the delays. They saw the memos piling up on desks. They stayed silent. They did not want to cross a rear admiral with friends in the Senate. They let the bureaucratic rot grow while the soldiers waited in the rain. The entire invasion fleet was stalled by a single man in a pristine uniform. The meeting in the basement of the headquarters came to a standstill. Colonel Robert Miller, 42, from Omaha, Nebraska, 1st Infantry Division, stood across the map table. He had seen the surf at Sicily. He had watched men disappear into the green water because they lacked a ramp. He pointed at the requisition order. "We need those 1,500 boats, Admiral," Miller said. Forsyth did not look up from his papers. "The request is denied. The invasion depends on those craft, Miller said. The invasion depends on ships that do not sink when a seagull lands on the rail, Forsyth replied. The Higgins boat is tested. It has a shallow draft. It can beach and retract in seconds. Forsyth leaned back. He adjusted his gold cufflinks. It is a floating box of splinters. It is the only vessel that can reach the shore. Then you have nothing. If we wait for steel hulls, we do not land until 1946. Miller said the Navy does not build with plywood. We build with steel and tradition. The men do not care about tradition when they are swimming in 1,000 yards of surf. Forsyth smiled. It was a cold, thin expression. The infantry is always in a hurry to die. My job is to ensure they do it from proper naval vessels. Eisenhower has already approved the design, Miller said. Eisenhower is a general. He understands the dirt. He does not understand the sea. You are blocking the entire landing fleet. I am protecting the Navy's standard. I will not sign for Plywood Coffins. Those coffins are the only thing that can get us to the beach. Then the beach will have to wait, Forsyth said. The Germans are not waiting. That is a tactical problem for your people. My problem is procurement. I refuse to authorize junk. This is a direct violation of the Planning Committee's directive, Miller said. The Navy answers to the department. Not a committee of mud-eaters. Miller felt the heat rising in his neck. He realized the man across from him was not looking at the war. He was looking at a ledger. He was looking at the prestige of Annapolis. He saw a man who would sacrifice 1,000,000 soldiers for a steel hull. I will have to report this, Admiral. Report it to the moon if you like. No Higgins boat will carry a Navy serial number while I hold this pen. Miller turned on his heel. He did not go to his commander. He went to the liaison office. He wrote a one-page summary of the impasse. He noted the Admiral's specific words. Plywood Coffins. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the curb outside the headquarters. He walked into the planning room without a word. He wore his full-dress uniform. The 4 stars on his helmet gleamed under the electric lights. The ivory-handled revolvers were visible on his belt. The room went cold. The colonels stepped back from the map tables. Forsyth stood his ground. Patton did not shout. He did not blink. He looked at the Admiral as if he were a specimen in a jar. Admiral, do you find the climate in London affects your ability to read a map? Patton asked. Forsyth straightened his tunic. It affects my ability to tolerate substandard equipment, General. You have blocked the Higgins order? I have. I will not authorize plywood coffins for our men. You believe a steel hull is the only answer for a beach landing? I do. It is the Navy way. It is the only way to ensure the safety of our sailors. And you are aware that your steel ships will not be ready for another 2 years? I am aware of the schedule. I prefer a delayed success to a prompt disaster, Forsyth said. Patton placed a small wooden box on the map table. He pulled out a scale model of a Higgins boat. He placed a basin of water in the center of the room. He filled it from a pitcher. He dropped the model in. It floated perfectly. He began to drop miniature lead soldiers into the craft. You see the world in blueprints and budgets. Admiral, you have spent your life in the dry air of Annapolis and the procurement offices of Washington. You think the Navy is a collection of polished brass and heavy plates. You believe that if a thing is not made of steel, it does not exist. The fact is that your steel ships are useless on a sloping beach. They draw too much water. They would stop in the breakers. The men would have to swim a mile under direct machine gun fire. Every man in that water would be dead before his boots touched the sand. You are not protecting them. You are guaranteeing their execution. Andrew Higgins built this boat for the bayous. He built it to run over logs and mud. He is a man who solves problems with his hands. It is not a pretty boat. It does not meet your aesthetic standards. But it works. It keeps its propellers shielded. It drops its ramp in the surf. It gives a farm boy from Iowa a fighting chance to get his feet on dry land. You are willing to stall the entire war to save your procurement record. You want to tell the history books that you never signed for wood. I do not care about your records. I care about the 30 divisions waiting for a way across the English Channel. You have a choice? You will sign that requisition order right now. Or you will walk with me to Eisenhower's office. You will look him in the eye. You will tell him that D-Day is canceled because a rear admiral is afraid of plywood. Decide in the next 10 seconds. The pen is on the table. Forsyth looked at the lead soldiers in the basin. He looked at the ivory revolvers. He reached for the pen. His hand was not steady. He signed the order. Patton picked up the paper and walked out without saying goodbye. Patton did not just take the signed paper. He took the Admiral's dignity. He ordered Forsyth to pick up the wet, wooden model from the basin of water. The Admiral's white dress gloves soaked up the dirty moisture as he gripped the miniature boat. The gold cufflinks caught the dim electric light as he clutched the toy like a common porter. Patton gestured toward the door. He made the Admiral walk the entire length of the headquarters hallway. Hundreds of officers watched from the doorways. They were men from the 1st Infantry and the 29th. They were the muddy colonels and tired majors who would have stayed on the docks if Forsyth had won his bureaucratic war. The Admiral could smell the damp wood and the sharp scent of lead paint. The small boat felt heavy in his hands. It felt like a confession. He had to carry the plywood craft like a tray of shame past the very men he had called mud-eaters. Outside, the London rain continued to fall. The signature was rushed to the telegraph office within the hour. The order for 1,500 Higgins boats went out across the Atlantic wires. In the New Orleans shipyards, the saws began to scream. In London, the Admiral stood on the front steps, holding a piece of wood. He looked like a man holding his own tombstone. The infantry officers did not salute him as they passed. They only looked at the boat. Andrew Higgins returned to the humidity of New Orleans after the final surrender. His factories had produced over 20,000 vessels by the end of the conflict. He remained a man of the bayou until his death in 1952. He never forgot the weight of the war or the men who relied on his plywood hulls. He lived to see the very steel ships the Navy had promised arrive in the Pacific long after the heavy fighting was over. He died as a hero of the working man, a civilian who changed the course of history with a saw and a dream. Rear Admiral Clayton Forsyth retired quietly in 1947. He moved to a brick house in Annapolis, Maryland. He spent his final years writing a long, bitter memoir that focused on the degradation of naval standards and the interference of the Army. No publisher ever accepted the manuscript. He died in 1961, alone in a room filled with silver trophies and dust. He never spoke about the meeting in London. He kept the memory of the wet wooden model locked away like a secret sin. Patton mentioned the encounter only once in a private letter to his wife. He wrote about the small-minded men who measured victory in steel instead of time. He noted that the war was won by the men who were willing to get their hands dirty, while the aristocrats looked for a towel. "I would rather have a wooden boat that floats than a steel ship that stays on a blueprint until the war is lost," he wrote. Some historians argue that Patton's confrontation was a reckless overreach that ignored legitimate naval concerns regarding technical safety. They suggest the Plywood Coffin label reflected a genuine worry about the vulnerability of wooden hulls to heavy coastal artillery. Others argue that the Higgins boat was the single most important piece of technology in the Allied arsenal, and any delay in procurement would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. What is certain is that Andrew Higgins delivered the fleet exactly when it was needed. His boats carried the Allied cause onto the beaches of Normandy, proving that victory often belongs to the man who builds a solution out of wood when others are still waiting for steel. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have forced the Admiral's hand in public, or would you have stayed within the chain of command? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.